You're listening to the Clear Creek Resources Podcast from Clear Creek Community Church. To hear more, check out clearcreekresources.org.
Welcome back to the Clear Creek Resources Podcast. My name is Tanner Smith. I'm your host today, joined by my friends Yancey Arrington.
Hey there.
Yancey's our teaching pastor. Thanks for being on, Yancey.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
Bruce Wesley.
Hey, Tanner.
Bruce Wesley's our lead pastor, also teaches often, and both these guys are here to help us take a closer look at our final text in the book of James. So we've been in the book of James for 12 weeks now, and it's been a pretty awesome series.
It's been a good run.
Yeah,
I think so too.
I think it's been good for our church.
Yeah.
Seriously good. But this is the final passage that we're preaching through this weekend, and so we're taking the opportunity today to kind of dive into it, take a closer look at it, look maybe a little bit outside of what was covered on Sunday morning. So let's start by having that text read. Yancey, would you mind reading that out loud for us?
Yeah, so this is James chapter 5, verses 19 and 20, which reads as such. My brothers, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and someone brings him back, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins.
This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Yeah,
So
simple
good.
2 verses. There you go.
Yeah, no, it's so comparatively to a lot of the texts that you guys have preached through the book of James over the last 12 weeks, this is a pretty small one.
Oh, yeah.
And yet it's got a lot inside of it. It's weighty and heavy. So we're going to cover that today. Let's start off just right at the gate, right out of the gate. What's the main idea of this text? So you guys are preaching through. What do you want someone walking out of the doors of Clear Creek having remembered, having known about what this text says?
We are responsible to bring back wanderers into the people of God.
Yeah. Any other way to say that?
No, well, 1,000, and I hope
Yeah.
we say it all
That's
kinds of ways,
No, it's
but
good.
yeah, the covenant community has a responsibility to the covenant community.
Yeah.
And when you become a part of it, you can only become a part of that covenant community through faith.
Yeah.
And then what I would argue is the initiatory right into that through baptism says, I want to be a part of it. And once you've done that, you say you're a part of a family. And if someone leaves to say, I don't think I believe in Jesus anymore, they, as Bruce said, they wander from the pathway of confessing Christ. Because we're a family, it's our responsibility to at least try to bring them back to a faith that only one kind of faith can rescue, and the faith in Christ alone. So,
Yeah, and people hear that and say, that sounds cultic.
Yeah, so
I mean, come on.
Yeah.
That, you're going to go get them back because they leave. And it's like, but someone who would say that, if they were in an experience of a covenant kind of community, they would never think that.
Right.
It's in the same way that they wouldn't think it's cultic that if they stormed out of a family meeting or they just didn't, for whatever reason, they stopped contacting their family members and their brother or their sister, literal brother or sister, called them on the phone and said, hey, dude, what's up?
Yeah.
You know, that wouldn't seem cultic. That would seem normal. Matter of fact, if you don't do that, it would seem like something is very dysfunctional in your family. If somebody can be, outside the family and you don't reach out to them. So if people are listening to this podcast and they hear this as cultic, they just really don't understand the nature of what the church is supposed to be about and the kind of family relationship that we have in the body of Christ.
We even have a term for that today. So like, it's if someone was a family member who had someone who was alienated from that family, the word is called estranged.
Yeah.
I have an estranged family member, and the reason that we call it that is because families are supposed to be cohesive. I mean, that's at least their default mode.
Yeah.
That's why James says what he says, because he's like, well, this is the new covenant family.
Yeah.
And not the new covenant organization or business
Or meeting.
or corporation or meeting.
Yeah.
Right. Not just the meeting on Sunday. We're a family, and just like you wouldn't call running after your wayward son meddling or kind of cultish, you would say that's what family does. So that's why James says what he says.
So let's address some of that language for a second, because we might use language like deconstruction or the phrase that keeps kind of coming up is wanderer. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of phrases out there right now that are kind of trigger words. I would say deconstruction is definitely one of those words.
It's a trigger word now. I don't know that.
Yeah, I would say for sure.
I know it's a word. I mean, I know it's a thing, but I didn't know it was a trigger word for people.
Yeah, I think words like toxic, people connect with their faith or with the background that they have, different things like that. When you say the word wanderer, what do you mean? What do we mean by that?
Well, let me just go back to deconstruction, and then Bruce can riff off of that with wanderer.
Yeah.
I'd agree And what we've said, are saying, and will say in this message when this pod goes up, I believe the following day, and we talk about, like, for many people, deconstruction is simply getting rid of the cultural accretions that have been put on Christianity that aren't really biblical.
Yeah.
You know, it's if you grew up in a Southern Baptist home in Texas in the 80s, there may be things that you did do or didn't do, which probably would be more liberal concerning, like, in people from the 50s in the Southern Baptist, like, well, we would never go to a moving picture show. We would.
Yeah.
That's what Christianity is. And so for some people, deconstruction is getting rid of these kind of, like, that's really not what the Bible's talking about. So maybe this is more cultural than Christian. We get that. But for the vast majority, deconstruction is leaving Christianity.
Right.
And so that's what we're trying to circle around. Ex-evangelical, that hashtag, deconstructing, that hashtag, upwards of 400,000 of those just on social media now. So that's the kind of, that's the wandering that we're talking about. So
Yeah, the word in the text, the original word, is where we get our word planet.
Okay.
And so, imagine someone in the ancient Near East looking up into the sky, and they see the stars, and they actually guide their sailing by the stars.
Right.
But the planets, that's different. The planets weren't always where they thought they were supposed to be, and so they were wandering. And so that's where that word then came from. And so what's he talking about? He's talking about people that you look for them where they're supposed to be, they're not there.
Yeah.
So I mean, literally, it's like they're not where they're supposed to be. They're doing their own thing.
Yeah.
And it's away from the family.
Right. That makes a lot of sense, I would say. So when we experience something like that, then what you guys are saying, the main idea of this text is that we have a responsibility. And who's the we in this text then?
Well, the we in this text is the covenant community. Okay. So James is obviously not addressing those who have apostatized, those who have left the faith. He's saying, all right, family, we've had some people leave, and it's your responsibility. I think Bruce made some notes earlier, like maybe he was talking to elders and some other people, but what's the language here in this text?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at the context, this is obviously the conclusion of the whole book.
Right, yeah.
But in the context, you'll remember in verse 13, he says, is anyone among you suffering? Verse 14, is anyone among you sick? And now in verses 19 and 20, he says, is if anyone among you.
That's helpful.
And so in the first two cases, it's these people reach out to the church for the church to step up and help. This is an instruction to the church to go help people who aren't going to reach out because they're wondering.
Yeah.
So the church has a responsibility to reach out when they're not asking for help.
That's good.
And that's where we get really uncomfortable.
Yes, that is definitely uncomfortable. Yeah. So back really quick, and I'm just going to touch on this for a second, but you mentioned the term deconstruction. We're basically meeting that term where it is in popular culture, which is people referencing that as alienating the faith or the church, right? Which is not necessarily maybe the original application of the word deconstruction. There's an element of deconstruction that's helpful.
Absolutely. Right? Getting rid of those cultural accretions.
Right, you mentioned that.
Get you back to a New Testament. So I'll give you an example. When everyone said you have to do Sunday school, and then Bruce and others like him plant a church now 30 years old, like Clear Creek, and they're like, we're going to do small groups. Well, you can't do small groups because churches do Sunday school. Well, let's look at Acts chapter 2, and that's and it's a very easy example, even how churches can have cultural things that really become somehow mountains of this is what biblical fidelity looks like. And the truth of it is, that's just one way to do it, and sometimes they're not even good accretions. And that happens throughout the last 21 centuries of the church. So that's a good deconstruction, which is you're stripping away to get to the essence and the truth of Christianity with things that got piled onto it. What we're trying to address is saying, like, that's fine and good, but really a lot of the weight of deconstruction, at least for people that use it, are using it for, I'm going to wander away from the faith. Right. And Christianity is not only is it not good, it's toxic, it's unhelpful, and I'm out. And then kind of whose responsibility is it now for those folks?
Yeah. Let me emphasize another kind of good deconstruction that, Yancey's talking about kind of methodological kind of deconstruction. But when people kind of leave fundamentalism as we know it, and by that I mean when actually the the restrictions that people put on themselves become a part of the gospel itself. Like, if you do this, they're naming behaviors.
Yeah.
Maybe even sins,
Right.
but they're saying, you do that, you're not a Christian. Or they say you can't be holy and do these things, and those things may or may not be sins according to the Bible.
Right.
Both of those situations would call for a deconstruction.
Yeah.
And good theology always does deconstruction.
That's true.
Because what people do is we want to add rules and, boundaries because we feel more comfortable with that. It makes us feel safe. But good theologians say, no. What does the Bible say? And in most cases, what we see is God giving a great deal of freedom and clarity instead of a whole bunch of boundaries and rules.
So what I hear you saying is even the way that Jesus taught would have been an element or one style of deconstruction.
Absolutely.
Essentially, because he's interacting with the religious leaders of that day and kind of taking off the outer layers that they had put on, taking off some of the erroneous aspects of that they had attached to their faith in order to say this is the most purest form actually of what God desires for us as his children.
That
as
would
his
be
people.
a great angle and appropriate angle to talk about the teaching of Jesus as a form of deconstruction in Judaism. It was really a fulfillment, but it was a deconstruction of the Judaism of the day, not the deconstruction of the Judaism that was given in the Old Testament necessarily.
Exactly.
And that's why I use the term accretion. I know it's a fancy word, but accretion means things that, deposits, if you will, that have accumulated on something over time.
Right.
And if you look at, I just finished reading a book, didn't writing it, finished reading a book on the theological development of Christian doctrine in the first 500 years of the church.
Yeah.
And you can just see over 500 years, there are things that kind of form on the surface of the church that weren't necessarily biblical. It's just how someone interpreted someone or something, and it just kind of stuck, and people added on to it. Whether it's, should we baptize babies?
Yeah.
Because we weren't doing that in the first 50 years of the church, but now we're going to. Should we? What do we do with the baptism of the Holy Spirit? Like, there's all these kinds of things.
Sort of a domino effect, isn't it?
Yeah, and so it just, over time, those things build. And that happens even today. So I really appreciate your reflection of that. That's exactly what Jesus was doing. In Matthew, he's reflecting. You've heard it said.
Yeah, exactly.
But I tell you, and really it's the idea of you've interpreted it this way, but I'm telling you what the Bible really says.
Because it's not a new direction. He's helping people get back to
He's the true reformer.
original meaning.
Right,
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I think the reason that that's helpful, especially for our listeners, is because we want to make the delineation between those terms. So the way that you're describing, in that sense, sort of a true deconstruction, is essentially a tighter grasp or a return to orthodoxy for the sake of following Jesus at its core, which is, in a lot of ways, is just what we would call spiritual formation.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
But the way that our kind of current culture, social media, some influencers, things like that, are interpreting and using that term is more in terms of like, I'm throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yes.
I found these issues, and instead of tearing it apart and finding the true core meaning behind what who I am as a follower of Jesus, I'm leaving that part of the faith. So then that's what we would then describe as somebody who's wandered from the faith. I just think that's helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, so kind of moving beyond that, I want to take a look at this text from through the theological lens for a second of kind of two different directions, and we can talk about both of them. They don't have to be separate. Sure. But a biblical theology, again, we've said this time and time again on this podcast, but each of these kind of themes and sections of text that we're studying, we try to look at through that lens with the hope of connecting this, not as some isolated occurrence in the scriptures, but as a part of the beautiful tapestry that is God's word, God's redemptive plan, the act of God redeeming a people for himself. So how does this call to the church fit into that greater biblical narrative?
Well, of the ways that this does, I would say, and really throughout James, it's the idea of what is the community of God?
Yeah.
And what are the people of God? And so you have God creating those people represented by Adam and Eve in Genesis 1, the introduction of sin, very shortly after that, and yet God comes to redeem a people.
Yeah.
And that people up in the Old Testament is Israel, and in the New Testament now is the church. And there's still a sense between old and new. There's this continuity of these are a people set apart to God. They're to be holy, and not just what they believe, but how they practice their lives. And really, that's the whole theme of James, is he's starting to see these guys deteriorate, at least some of them.
Yeah.
And to be fair, this is hypothetical. He says, if anyone. So he's not thinking there's just one person, but there are people kind of being reabsorbed into this, which is no different than what had happened in the Old Testament with Israelites trying to be reabsorbed to the nations around them. And so he's just simply saying, if really somewhat with Hebrews, if they've tasted of, at least the idea of grace and being a part of a gospel community, they're worth going after.
Yeah.
Now, we would say that's true about anybody, but James is focusing on the gospel community, which is, again, God's people still have this tight-knit DNA, are supposed to, as a family. So, and that's how God's always established that. If we're going to do biblical theology, when Christ returns, he's returning for his family.
Right.
Now God will be with his family in a different way than he was even with the church by the Spirit, or even, it really is kind of a bookend to Genesis 1.
Yeah.
So this is just James working that out in real time with his world, saying, all right, what's the people of God going to look like, and what are our responsibilities as such? So.
Yeah, that's helpful. Okay, so similar question, but through the lens of systematic theology, what are some doctrines that are found within this text? So obviously there's kind of the question about maybe perseverance of the saints, some soteriology topics. So what do you guys see in there? What can we bring out?
Yeah, God is saving a people to himself. So when we talk about soteriology, we would, in soteriology meaning a doctrine of salvation, that God saves, he saves us, but he saves a people to himself. So when he saves an individual, he saves that individual into a people.
Not just some isolated person out by themselves trying to figure out their faith.
Which, man, is such a radical idea in our day of individualism.
That's correct.
That it is even hard for people to hear it. I mean, when I say hard to hear, it's hard for them to understand what we're really talking about.
Yeah, right.
And that's why when we started out, I said that sounds cultic, is because immediately when the church acts like the church as we see it in the Bible, or the people of God in the Old Testament, which is Israel, and now we see a different kind of people, a fulfillment of that previous picture that was a broken picture, just like the church today is broken, and one day we're going to see it in its fullness. Yeah. Well, in that case, we oftentimes miss how we can have individual responsibility, but what that individual responsibility does is it affects a whole community of people, right? And so what this passage assumes is an understanding of this community, this mutuality. And so we could take that doctrine and then talk about spiritual formation, or the doctrine of sanctification, how God grows us to be more like Jesus, and he does so in the context of that community.
Right.
We can't do this by ourselves. And it's really interesting to hear when people talk about how they grow spiritually, a lot of it just boils down to me and Jesus, me and my Bible.
People would ask, how's your personal relationship with God?
There you go. How's your personal relationship with God? Which, in one sense, we have a personal relationship with God, but we don't experience it alone.
Alone, yeah.
Our personal relationship with God affects this corporate relationship with God, because we're a part of the people of God. So in those doctrines, then, I see both the church and a real key emphasis on how sanctification happens through mutual responsibility in the life of a church.
That's good. That's helpful. Okay, so from is there anything else on that before I don't want to move on?
No,
cool.
That's great.
From a practical standpoint, so obviously we always like to talk about application, and I think kind of one of the questions that we often ask is like, what didn't make it into your sermon? So I'm sort of asking two questions here, but from a practical standpoint, we want to look at how do we live this out? Why should we live this out? And maybe from an angle that you didn't quite cover in your sermon, because I imagine part of the sermon is, well, here's why we should do this, and here's how we should do this. So let's look kind of outside of the lens of what you preached on Sunday morning through this text. Why and how should we as the people of God reach out to people?
Yeah, I think and Bruce and I talk about whoever's preaching, whatever team of preachers are preaching that weekend. We always dialogue about what we're doing and what we wish we could keep, and what just is not going to make it because we don't want to be there for 5 hours. Or actually, I probably would like to be there for 5 hours.
Yeah, for sure.
I think for this message, because it's so practical, and James is simply saying, go after and try to bring people back.
Yeah.
And so kind of the question that a lot of people would say is, well, how do we do that?
Right.
Is there a better way to do that than others? And I know that I've stressed in mine is like, humble and gracious and loving as kind of descriptors of the way that you should do that. But I think there's a lot of things I'd like to say. I'd like to talk to people about let's use a hypothetical. Let's just say someone's got a child.
Yeah.
Who's
which, by the way, I think is extremely applicable to a lot of people who are probably listening to this
Yeah,
podcast.
yeah, you're right. I think a lot of people have children.
Well, thank you. Come on,
Yeah,
Yancey.
no. I said this. We're filming this the day after I've preached this on Wednesday, and I
Yeah.
did say what I've seen at Clear Creek is I have seen people commit apostasy. I've seen people leave the faith, but I've really seen a lot of children
Yeah.
who've grown up in our church that go off to college and then they kind of punt
Yeah.
Jesus. Now, the debate is that just a phase, or is it, either way, it's very stressful.
Yeah.
And so what I would love to do, and we do this from time to time, especially because we're a church for the unchurched.
Right.
We want people to be able to have their doubts and bring them here.
Yeah.
And I think some people have grown up in some religious environments where I don't think anyone wants to doubt. I mean, Jesus talks about doubt. James even talks about how doubt's not necessarily great. Are you a doubter? But it's just a part of growing.
Yeah.
I've heard Bruce say this before, and I've always held on to it. Your beliefs are on loan.
Yeah.
Probably from your parents
Right.
or someone who is a loved one until they become your own. And so there's a gap between loan and own for a lot of people. And to get from loan to own, you got to work through some doubts.
Yeah.
And that's just normal and natural. And I would love to help people understand, like, that's a normal part of growing, is to have doubts. But sometimes people have a doubt and they think, oh, all is lost. If I don't have every answer, I just can't follow Jesus. And no one operates like that. I don't know how planes work. I just get in one and they go. I don't know how electricity really works. I just trust that it does. And so that's kind of a canard. Like, no one, that's really not a good argument, but people feel that way. And what I would want to do is just bring them all inside and say, listen, man, this is the same church that has loved you for the last however long you've been here. We want to continue to do that and work with you. And what I want to stress to people is the community is there to show you what it's like to follow Jesus, to show you what it's like to live in the kingdom. And do so in a way that I'm not twisting your arm. I'm not going to guilt trip you. I just want to dialogue and journey with you.
Well, that's one of the things that makes this topic of conversation not cultic, right? If this was a cult, there's a lot of fear that comes with, oh, someone's doubting.
Yeah.
Oh, someone's walking away. It's not driven by or motivated by fear, right? This kind of action is motivated by love for someone else. It's a love for someone else that within the body of Christ, we experience a love like no other. We experience the love of Christ, love for one another. So there isn't, it's not motivated by fear of someone doubting or maybe someone's going to, the reason for that is God is not afraid of our doubts. Like we see that in the scriptures, right? That God, he's okay with the psalmist coming to him and just saying, "Where are you? Are you really around through all this?"
Yeah.
And the reason that's so important is, just to reiterate for our listeners, is because when people start doubting, if they think doubting is somehow bad, illegal, frowned upon, even people might feel guilty when they have doubts.
Yes.
And if that's the case, then we haven't done a good enough job teaching about what faith looks like, because faith always includes an element of doubt. That's why it is faith. If we had absolute proof of everything that we say that we believe, we would have no reason to allow doubt. But faith in itself has room for uncertainty.
Yes.
So we're choosing to believe something that we don't have absolute certainty about everything regarding it, right? And that's where doubt kind of comes in. What happens with people who are deconstructing or they're wandering away is once they have doubt, they oftentimes add isolation to that, because for whatever reason, they feel like they can't talk to certain people. Like you say, if it's a more cultic environment and there's guilt surrounding doubt or shame surrounding doubt, then people want to wander away from that. They want to go process this with someone who understands their questions and their doubts. And oftentimes in our culture, what happens in churches is people go find someone who doesn't believe the gospel of Jesus, and they want to process with that person, when in fact, we've got to create an environment where you can bring all your doubts to the people who love Jesus and they love you, and process them however long it takes for there to be greater understanding. That's where sanctification happens, right? When we have those doubts, but and we stay in community with those doubts. But when we get into isolation, that's when we get into trouble. And so I want to go down that path before we're done.
Yes. No, well, I think that's good. So as the people that are listening, as the people that are listeners, so say we have a listener they got their teenage child
Yeah.
who's dealing with doubts and is like, I don't know. I mean, I know I've grown up in church. I don't know if I believe the same stuff that you believe. How could the God that we say is so loving, like, how could he reject this person or that person? Or how could he say that this person is not going to heaven, based on their behaviors or whatever? So they're asking some of those larger questions. What you're saying is then it's kind of our responsibility before even the apostasy takes place to be a helpful listener, to be somebody that is trustworthy, that can sit down with them without any kind of fear or without trying to strong arm them with maybe like a kind of a toxic approach, is again where that word would come into play, but just to be a good listener to start.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I would want a person in that place to know you're not the first one who's asked this question.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
Right.
And people have given a lot of energy to this question. And I mean, it'd be interesting to see if someone could ask a question that we couldn't say that about,
Yeah.
But chances are they're asking the same. Most people who want to talk with me because they have some doubts, the questions they ask are classic
Yes.
apologetic questions.
Yeah.
Why is there so much suffering in the world?
Right.
How is it that these people can be a part of the covenant people of God and that person is not, and therefore is going to experience eternal judgment?
Yeah.
And it's like, that just doesn't seem right, because these people had advantages and those people didn't have advantages. And all those are great questions.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, going down the road of trying to answer those questions really is part of the path of sanctification, of knowing God better for who he really is, not for who we or others might represent him to be.
And that's a part of discipleship at its core.
Absolutely.
Yeah. A part of learning to follow Jesus, who Jesus is, who he calls us to be, is struggling and wrestling, with those questions, with those doubts.
Yeah. No, I think a good gospel culture has oxygen for entertaining questions.
That's
and
good.
I think that's got to be an important part of it. I think it's a neat reflection, or at least for me, when you look at kind of the responsibility of the covenant community, in Corinthians, when there's someone who says they're a part of the community, but they don't mind messing up community, Paul says, get rid of those people.
Yeah.
Like they're willfully sinning, and they don't mind if that sin breaks the fellowship. Paul's like, church discipline that guy. So, but then James, who's playing off the same sheet music that Paul is, he's saying, but in that same community, if someone just leaves you guys.
Yeah.
They're not messing with you at all. They just left. You go after them. You go run after them. And I was turning here to Jude in light of people who talk about having doubts. And in Jude, verse 24, it says, in verse 22 it says, and have mercy on those who doubt. Verse 23, have mercy on those who doubt, save others by snatching them out of the fire.
Yeah.
And I think it's a good companion piece to what we see here in James. It's like, listen, people are going to have doubts. We ought to have mercy on them. And one of the ways we show mercy to them is by going out to them. To me, it feels like you're judging them when you don't reach out to them. Like, how unloving is it for you to go, well, you know what? Because of this expressive individualism where everyone's kind of on their own path and we all just kind of look within to find our answers.
Yeah.
Where they would say, hey, you're just meddling with somebody.
Yeah.
The gospel would say, no, that's what family does. They run after people that said that they were going to be a part of that family, and they stick with them until they just can't come anymore. They don't want to be with it anymore. And I think that both of those realities can be true.
Yeah.
Corinthians can be just as true as what we see here in James, but I just love the heart behind it all, especially with doubts. Have mercy on those who doubt, and we want to help those kinds of people.
Yeah.
That's why we have classes. And, if I could spend another hour teaching, I would tell people what you believe is important.
Yeah.
But why you believe what you believe is just as important.
Right.
Because all someone has to do is to just, if you don't know why, it'll take them 2 seconds to knock the stool out under your feet.
Yeah.
And then now you're going, oh no, what do I believe? I can't believe is this right or this wrong?
I couldn't argue them into
No, and I told people last night, you're for some of us that we're only one good argument away from losing our faith, or really struggling, I should say. And Bruce is right. I want to reiterate, for 21 centuries, the people of God have been able to withstand any kind of question or philosophical problem thrown against it.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that everyone's answers are going to be nice, and there's a lot of mystery, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
But there's nothing out there that the world can throw at us where we should be able to go, we don't know what to do here.
Yeah. There's something really interesting to me about what you just read in Jude whenever he mentions snatch them from the fire, because I think of fire as destructive. So you mentioned watching them go and just being like, oh, well, I guess maybe they'll figure out their way is actually the less loving thing to do. And that's because we truly believe that maybe in this instance, because we've talked about kind of the deconstruction, and we could talk about that some more, and just in terms of doubts. But another kind of case study of this would be somebody walking away from the faith who's like, dude, I know it's all true. I just want to live a life of sin. Like, I literally just want to go experience the classic lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life. Like, I don't care. I just simply don't care.
Yeah.
And to pursue that person in love is to pull them back from what would be ultimately destructive for them as people.
Yeah, and I think that's really the pattern. That's the general pattern, is that, let's just use the hypothetical kid that goes off to college.
Sure.
He may have grown up in a very strict, conservative, religious environment, felt a little too much of the accretion, not enough of the Christianity.
Yeah.
And so now he or she's going to sow their wild oats, do their own thing. And then when they get a taste of the kind of the fallenness of the world, they'll start to justify it. Well, here's what I now believe about gender or sexuality or money or family or marriage.
Yeah.
And so they start to disagree with the Bible because really the Bible just disagrees with them and the choices they've made. And so that's what happens oftentimes. And so it's the slow degree to apostatizing.
Yeah.
It's this slow capitulation to the world and compromise where they never really knew why they believed what they believed, and so now there's smart enough people around them and experiences that they didn't have to kind of delude them into thinking this is what's true and this is what's real. And I do think it's interesting, going back to the text, that James says, "My brothers, if any of you wanders from the truth," which Doug Moo, who really great, renowned scholar, talks about this in James. He says that the truth really encompasses everything there is about the gospel. And when you talk about like raising your kids, like you want them to see the beauty of the gospel, the glory. I don't mean that in some religious sense. Like there is a glorious, like freedom. The gospel of Jesus is the very best thing for all of us.
Yeah.
The kingdom of God is the very best thing for all of us. And that's really what you're trying to pour into your kids when they're growing up. So that when they go to these other places, first of all, they need to know why they believe what they believe.
Right.
But they can see what the world offers and how it pales in comparison to the beauty and glory of having this beautiful relationship with God in Christ, where we're forever loved, forever forgiven, a part of a real community, on mission, that makes a real dent, where your life's worth something.
Right, purpose.
So don't get me going, I'll start preaching.
No,
I think, because we're on the practical side of this, and we talk about doubt and how it is really the beginning place of deconstruction, whether it's a good or a bad deconstruction.
Yeah.
But practically, when someone wanders away, what do we do? And, even we use the language, you go pursue them.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases, I don't think we even have to pursue them. We just have to remain with them.
Yeah.
That's
right?
great. That's
Just,
great.
just
That's great.
stay in the conversation.
Yeah.
Keep making a phone call.
Be present.
Be present. Keep being a friend. And even if that person is wandering and they want to go, whether it's for moral reasons, party life, or creedal reasons, what they believe, then you just stay in the conversation. And staying in the conversation is the way that we get beyond the weirdness, right? Because what happens is we get to that place where if we didn't stay in the conversation, now we have to take some risks.
Right.
And the risk is, how do I re-engage with this person in a way that they know that I'm not judging, I'm not being holier than thou, I'm really just loving them, and I'm trying to be present for them, but we've been distant. So, I think the key word is stay connected as much as you can. If you have a lot of doubts, stay connected in a faith community to continue to have those conversations. Or if you have people that you love who are deconstructing or they're wandering, then stay connected with them. Continue to have the conversation. And not meaning turn every conversation back to, well, do you believe now?
Yeah.
Or, but, in really normal ways, have conversations so that they get to bring up in normal ways what they're processing, what they're dealing with,
Yeah. So what you're describing is relationship.
Right.
Because the difference is when we treat people like projects, it's like, okay, well, Yancey said I gotta reach out to those that are wondering. So it's on my to-do list to make sure that person comes back to faith, like whatever. Then our mindset around that is just this goal-oriented, like I've got to just solve the problem here, as opposed to, what maybe some people have even done for us, which has just been there for us, been around in relationship.
Oh yeah,
I think I agree with what Bruce has said. I think it's probably more of an art than a science. I mean, the text does say whoever brings back a sinner.
Yeah.
So let's not be confused in the hearing of this. What Bruce isn't saying is that we don't ever tell someone the truth.
Yeah.
I mean, but truth outside of relationship feels like you're strong-arming somebody.
Yeah.
Truth within a relationship, that's a whole different kind of hearing. I mean, I just relate, if this is a family, I relate with my kids. I tell my kids things they're doing wrong.
Yeah.
But I do this in the context of a relationship, and I sure don't do it because I'm high and mighty, because I'm a sinner as well. So like what I always want to tell people is just remember, you're a sinner going out to try to talk to another sinner about following a Savior that you've embraced, that without him, you'd have no hope. So there's no kind of, where Christians blow it up.
Yeah.
Is when we get self-righteous, as if we've never done anything wrong. And so, again, humility presses forward. But I'm convicted. We can talk about this soon. But I'm convicted. Like whoever brings back a sinner, like at some point, it will do someone well for them to hear where you're going is not the place you need to go, and Jesus has called you to something different, and what you're doing is not the way of the kingdom. But I mean, I'm summarizing what could be a 6 month, 6 year, 60 year kind of conversation. But I just like that if it's a slow burn, then it's a slow burn, and we're with them the whole way, so that they know that they've left a place that loves them deeply.
Yeah. I want to ask a question that relates kind of more personal, but before I do that, is there anything else that we didn't get to touch on that you guys want to touch on?
Yeah, there is something for me. Yeah, I said I want to come back to this whole idea of isolation.
That's good.
So I think that in our suburban, exurban kind of experience, parents have to keep in mind that the choices that they make are really communicating a value set to their children about the nature of community. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm going to take a little risk here to not be misunderstood.
Yeah.
There are a lot of things that we involve our kids in that are great things to do. A lot of extracurricular, if you will, kind of things, whether it be baseball, cheer, any kind of a music thing. But when we involve them in things that take them out of the church, I'm not talking about for a Sunday, like you have to go to church every Sunday.
Yeah.
I'm talking about you've just taken them out of the church. Then the risk is that they no longer understand, they don't have any basis for understanding this passage.
Yeah.
Where there are people beyond my parents in my life who care about me and who care about my spiritual growth, who care about how worship shapes my heart and mind.
Yeah.
And community is a part of my spiritual growth, my sanctification. And so, the caution to parents is, part of the wondering begins not with doubt, but with drift. We just kind of drift because we were doing something else, and it became really important in the moment. And so all of a sudden, the 10-year-old baseball team became more important than the man that God is going to make that 10-year-old boy be as a follower of Jesus. Now,
that's good.
That last comment, I know people are like, "Oh, come on," that's.
No, yeah.
But understand that that's how it happens. It just happens a degree at a time. It's a little bit of drift at a time. So don't take your kids out of baseball. Don't take your kids out of cheer. I'm not saying that. Unless you're allowing those things to become an idol that is more important for what you hope for your child than a relationship with Jesus. And then you probably should take them out because evidently you can't handle it,
Yeah, and that's ultimately communicating to them that their individualistic expression is more important than the community that God has placed them in.
Yeah.
In some ways, if it's gotten to that point, right? That's extremely helpful, and I think practical for people as well. I think one of the best ways to understand this text is for us to kind of see it inside of the context of a story. So whether it's maybe a story that you've had, or something that as you have been reading this and studying for this, that God's kind of like put something on your heart. Is there any way that we can kind of see or understand this within the context of a real life example, whether you guys have had or that someone else in our church has had? And I'm asking you that on the fly, so it's okay to take a second to think about it.
Well, I have had a handful of friends of mine, and I would even say Bruce and I together have probably, I would also use the term handful of friends of ours who are pastors that aren't pastoring anymore for various reasons, all their own fault. And I'm not trying to pile on. I'm just saying it's because of various sin issues, and some of them would even question if they're even believers today. I've had friends of mine, close friends of mine, that would probably say, they might tell me that they're still followers of Jesus, but really, in all intents and purposes, even their own family members would say that they're not. They've kind of drifted away, and they're kind of angry at. You can always tell what you're angry at. That exposes kind of, what you believe and what you don't believe. They're angry at the church, or angry at even the best expressions of church. And it doesn't mean that the church is perfect. Don't hear me say that. But I don't know about the whole Jesus stuff anymore. And they start to entertain different religions and those kinds of things. So yeah, I've had that. So when I work through some texts like this, those are the people. I've got names and faces, and I think of people from our church. I've Bruce and I have talked about just different people over the time who adults. Some of them were children who grew up in our student ministries that even led stuff, and now have kind of abandoned at least what we would say is Orthodox Christianity, if not Christianity in general. And that's as I shared in the first time I gave this message. It's hard for all of us. It's hard, especially for parents or siblings or friends. It's hard for the church. I mean, we're the pastors or ministers and lay people, our navigators and volunteers. We pour into these folks, into all of us, because we're a family, and it just hurts when you have someone who kind of spirals out into another orbit that's far from Jesus. And so, I'm praying like, Lord, I just pray that they're just in a bad spot. Like King David was in a bad spot, like Peter was in a bad spot, like I've been in a bad spot, and that they come back and persevere. And yet I try to think like, Lord, where's the intersection for me with some of those folks? And I've had a lot of those conversations, and they're just hard. They're hard. They're very hard. But if Jesus left the 99 to go after the one, left the 99 sheep to go after one, I don't know when getting there if that person's going to be a sheep or a goat, because I don't know the future. I just know that it seems like the heart of the gospel and the heart of a good shepherd is to go after them. And so that's the stuff that burdens me. So that's how I've thought about that.
No,
that's how that
really
text
helpful.
worked on me this week.
Yeah, that's helpful.
And
Thanks
I
for
appreciate
sharing
the question. I honestly probably don't have a story that I feel comfortable just telling.
that. Yeah, sure.
But I do have, I can just tell you in general, as a pastor, one of the things that causes me deep sadness is I think, relatively large number of people that were engaged in growing in their faith. And I mean, I could call names of a list who are, as far as I know, totally disengaged from the church. Now, whether they're disengaged from praying or reading the Bible, obviously I don't know the answer to that. But it's a really sad thing. But then I'm hopeful because realize James is bringing this up from the earliest Christians. Jesus'
is half brother leading a church.
He's bringing this up from the earliest Christians who are now gone into a hostile world, and some of them are getting sucked into the vortex of some of the darkness in that world, and they're disenfranchising, deconstructing, whatever, and he is calling the church to continue to reach out to them. And so that's hopeful for me to say this is probably a normal experience, because at the same time, we get that long list of people who came to faith in Jesus at 5, or they've been in the church their whole life, and they've never wandered from the faith. And so it's not like Christianity is this temporary thing and everyone wanders away. But it is like there is a kind of endurance and perseverance to which we're called. Yeah. And God doesn't expect us to do that alone.
Yeah.
He expects us to do that together.
That's good. And I think just to kind of wrap up, to say that there is also, if James is bringing this up and it's a call to action, then there's also hope that Christ really does bring people back to himself.
He does.
That he really does restore people into the community of faith, that we really can see restoration, reconciliation happen in the context of that biblical community. So that's hopeful. So for those of you listening that are worried and burdened and troubled over those in your life that have walked away or are walking away currently or experiencing doubt or sowing their wild oats, so to speak, or whatever it is, that God's at work in their lives. You may or may not see it, but he invites us to be a part of it. He invites us to open up our eyes to see and our ears to hear how we can be a part of his work of redeeming people.
Amen.
So thank you guys for sharing and for preaching and for the ways that you sow into the church. This has been a fantastic podcast and a fantastic series. One more resource I want to just tell our listeners about that I think would be helpful for this is something that we call BLESS. It's an acronym that we use in terms of reaching out even to those outside of the faith, but I think it's helpful even with this because it's really just daily practices of hospitality, to stay in people's lives, to be friends and be in community with one another. So you can find that on clearcreekresources.org, information around that, but that's helpful practical ways that we can practice hospitality and stay in community with people. So, guys, thanks again.
Yeah, thanks,
so
Tam.
much.
Thank
Grateful
you, Tam.
for y'all and looking forward to what's next for Clear Creek Resources podcast. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Hey, thanks for checking out this video. If you haven't yet, make sure that you hit subscribe down below and check out clearcreekresources.org where we have videos, books, and sermons on there, as well as our audio podcast. Thanks for watching.